So I want to start by talking a little bit about the birds and the bees. And so this is the classic talk about the birds and the bees, the flowers and the trees, and I'll mention some of those as well, but I'm going to give this a slightly different twist. And so the two animals that I want to focus on today, the birds, they both provide some very incredible provisioning services to really try to really increase the ecosystem services where we live. And so, for example, Doug Tallamy from the University of Delaware painstakingly documented the number of insects it takes to raise one clutch, one family of chickadees. And he estimated it between 7,000 to 9,000 insects for just one single family. And this is pretty incredible when we think about how many caterpillars, and you see this one picture on the left-hand side of this Carolina chickadee, how many caterpillars it takes just to raise that one family. And this is not an isolated case. So when we think about the number of birds that we can see just outside of our backyard, the number of insects that it's going to take to raise their families, it really adds up to a lot. And so they really provide this tremendous resource for us and this tremendous service by really keeping our insect populations in check. And then when we think about the insects, particularly the bees, they also perform these really extraordinary services for us, primarily in the form of pollination. And scientists have been able to quantify the pollination service that bees provide, and this includes native bees, but primarily honeybees, and is estimated to be around $56 billion per year. And they provide this vital component to our agricultural systems, and without bees, our whole food systems would pretty much collapse. But in addition to these provisioning services, these birds and bees also provide these cultural services as well. And so birders are a fanatic group of people. We spend millions of dollars traveling around the world trying to see that one specific species, or just going out into our local patch. And we gain so much enjoyment just from being outside and enjoying our feathered friends. And bees also provide ways for us to reconnect with nature in one form of beekeeping. And again, this is an activity that people will spend a lot of money to go out and raise bees to try to provide some honey, and this could be either on a professional or an amateur basis. But there's also what I'm calling these beers, these people that go out and identify bees just for fun and can spend hours upon hours just trying to identify one individual bee. And we do this because it makes us happy. And this is something that's really difficult to quantify, but I'm sure everybody on this call can really appreciate how much these animals can really add to our well-being. And so one of the biggest threats to our wildlife populations is urbanization and just the basic form of development. And the way that scientists have really trying to quantify how animals are responding to land use change is by looking at animal populations and communities along an urban to rural gradient. And so as a wildlife biologist who studies urban animals, one of the things that's really nice about using this approach is that we do get to go out into these wild places. And so when we think about it, these are our forests, our pristine forests and grasslands and deserts. And then as we get a little developed, we see some of these more rural or ex-urban areas. In New England, we would call these the sticks. And then as areas get a little bit more developed, we see this drastic change in the amount and type of green space to our suburbs and suburban areas, residential areas, until we get our most urbanized places, our cities, our downtown areas. And these are really exemplified by the amount of impervious surface. However, you can still see these little patches of green space throughout. And so by looking at how animals have responded to different degrees of urbanization, what we have found is that these really striking patterns is that as we become a more urbanized area, we see this drastic decline in biodiversity and species richness. So we have fewer species that are able to persist in our more urban areas. And the primary reason because of this is the loss of habitat and the alteration of habitat. And so many conservation organizations have really targeted the rural end of the gradient to be able to get more bang for your conservation buck. And many wildlife populations have responded to this and have rebounded because of these efforts. However, when we think about this statistic, that this is the place where the majority of Americans are having their primary interaction with the natural world, it really becomes imperative that we create these wildlife habitats that can support wildlife, so that we have the opportunity to enhance and strengthen the ecosystem services that our birds and our bees can provide for people. And so the urban forest, and this is something that's pretty familiar to everybody, most everybody on this webinar, is not all doom and gloom. There's actually a tremendous amount of variation within our cities with regards to green spaces. And here's an example of a couple of different types of green spaces or parts of the urban forest that we can find, ranging from rooftop gardens to pocket parks to office parks as well. And then another classic area of green spaces are these residential landscapes. And this is a very typical scene in a New England town in the fall, not so much right now. We're just about to start getting rid of most of our 2 to 3 feet of snow, so hopefully soon we will start seeing some greenery. But this is just a very serene image. But when I look at these street trees and these different residential areas, I see all of this potential wildlife habitat. So for example, when we look a little bit closer in these trees, there are these opportunities for nesting. So we have dead wood that's present in our street trees, and these could be great resources for cavity nesting species like woodpeckers and also for owls. There's nests that are that we might be able to find up in the higher areas in the up here in the higher areas of the canopy for some of our species that like to nest higher up. And then there's also opportunities for ground nesting animals as well. And in addition to these nesting opportunities, there's other types of resources that wildlife require to persist in these different types of environments. We can see things like nectar from these plants that people might be having in their gardens. We also might see some water in here. This is the only example I could find is a water hydrant. But there's earthworms that are scuttering around underneath our lawns that are really great resources for a lot of different animals. And again, some cover for other activities for birds and other types of wildlife to hide. And this might be an example of how some of these species, some of these birds and bees might fall out within these residential landscapes. And so one of the things, though, that we're really trying to figure out, though, is what are these optimal conditions? And so our research with the U.S. Forest Service and the University of Massachusetts is investigating 3 lines of inquiry. First, we're assessing habitat potential using the urban forest assessment tool iTree. Second, we're expanding our conservation partners with the Neighborhood Nest Watch program. And third, we're creating habitat in our Sustainability Begins at Home project. And I'm going to describe these 3 different projects in detail now. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about this new module called iTree Wildlife. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about iTree, but I'd be more than happy to answer questions after the presentations. And so the main goal of this module to the Urban Forest Assessment Tool is to develop a way to do a rapid assessment of the habitat quality and the habitat availability within our urban forests. And the way we're doing this is we're building habitat models based on the literature of what different types of species, and at this stage we're working with birds, what types of habitat features these birds require. And we're putting that into these iTree models that are part of Dave Nowak's team in Syracuse and some of his other partners. And we're able to use this information to start assessing what the quality and the potential habitat exists in these urban forests, and then we can use this information to try to improve these habitat management plans, and then we have this ultimate goal of increasing urban bird diversity. So going back to that trend that I showed in terms of that urban-rural gradient and how wildlife is responding. And so I'll use the red-bellied woodpecker as an example to show you how the project works and how iTree Wildlife can be applied. And so for most species, there's a few key habitat features that they're going to be responding to. And we can model the variation within this particular habitat feature with how likely a species will use the habitat. And so here we have the percent canopy on the x-axis here. And we have the suitability index over here on this y-axis. And so a suitability of 0, we're not going to see these birds at all, to 1 being very optimal habitat. And what this is showing is that roughly at around 36 to 37% canopy cover, this is where we're actually going to start seeing really optimal conditions for this species. But another thing to note is that not necessarily the more is better, is that we reach a certain threshold that once we get above 60-ish% of canopy cover, all of a sudden the conditions aren't as optimal for this particular species. So we use this information, we create these habitat models, and for most of the species that we've been modeling so far, and we're up to about 9 different species that are found predominantly in the northeastern part of the country, and we have a few, with each species we have between 3 to 5 different habitat features that these birds are responding to. So with the red-bellied woodpecker, in addition to canopy percentage, these birds also need large trees that are larger than about 23 centimeters in diameter, a pretty dense basal area within a hectare, and also they need to have some dead and decaying wood because these are primary cavity nesting species. And so I have the different habitat variables up here in the top part of this table here. And then to show you how this works, I'm going to give examples from the city of Philadelphia and New York City, and then also 2 different land use types. We have our high density residential up on the top, and then a forest fragment on the bottom. And these yellow circles represent these iTree plots, these 0.04 hectare plots where we're actually going out and collecting the real-time data. And so based on our habitat models, what we know in terms of the optimal conditions are just listed below. So we know, as I mentioned, with the canopy percent, between 35 and 62% represent the suitability of around 1. And so what we found in terms of what actually exists within these different cities and in these different land use types are the numbers that I've just put up now. And there's a few interesting things that I want to kind of go over a little bit in detail. So first, these numbers here represent the total suitability for each of these cities and for each of these different land use types. And so remember, a 1 is most suitable. So based on using the iTree wildlife module, what we can see is that in these forest fragments in Philadelphia, these provide some really decent wildlife habitat for red-bellied woodpeckers. In New York City, not so much. And then we see kind of a decline in habitat suitability in both Philadelphia and New York City in these more residential areas. And when we look at some of the different numbers, we can see here, at least with regards to canopy percent, it falls pretty far below our threshold of 35 to 62%. And I've circled a few other examples as well, whereas basal area for Philadelphia falls very nicely within the optimality, whereas in New York City it does not. And the same with the amount of dead wood present. And some of these reasonings behind these differences could be due to some of these management choices that urban foresters might be making in these different cities. And so in sum, what we've been able to see with the iTree wildlife habitat module, and what we're hoping for it to be able to do, is to really provide a rapid assessment of the habitat quality and habitat potential within the urban forest. We're also able to provide some detailed information about what habitat features are required to support these animals. And so rather than having a blanketed statement of, well, just plant more trees, we can go back into these models and to see what the optimality is, and we can notice that, okay, well, if maybe the city has 20% canopy cover, the red-bellied woodpeckers need 35%, so therefore we can start designing our management goals accordingly. Okay, so moving from modeling to actively assessing the urban birds, I want to talk a little bit about our Neighborhood Nest Watch project and citizen science. And the Neighborhood Nest Watch project is a program that was started by Dr. Peter Mara from the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center back in the year 2000. And this was a citizen science project based in Washington, D.C., where he was actively assessing the health of these backyard bird populations. In the year 2012 and since then, we've added on 4 additional cities to really start assessing these patterns along a north to south gradient along the East Coast, but also along this urban to rural gradient. And now we're able to start quantifying the health and productivity of some of these backyard birds. And when we think about birds in general, they're probably one of the species, the groups of animals that we know the most about. They're so well studied. However, most of the information that we know about birds is from more natural wild systems. And so we don't know whether these patterns are the same. And we also don't know some of the stressors that some of these birds are facing, which is really integral to understand how to better improve habitat management plans for the benefit of these species. And so the project has 2 main components. We have the science component, and within the science, we're looking at 2 major questions with regards to these vital rates of these animal populations. So first, we're looking at year-to-year survival. So how long do these birds live? And so one of the things that people will say, especially with backyard birds, is that people have a stronger, more intimate connection with their birds. They might often say, oh, my robin is back again this year. However, we don't necessarily know if it's the same robin that's returning to your backyard every single year. But with our research program, what we're able to do is to catch these birds and put these unique color bands on these birds, and then they start having these individual ways that we can identify. So here in this picture, we have a picture of a gray catbird, and we can now say, oh, well, this is yellow over silver and red, and he's back for the 3rd year in a row. So now we know this bird is at least 3 years old, and we can start making some inferences about what types of stressors it might or might not be facing, depending on some other different types of some issues that it might be facing along an urban to rural gradient. The second component that we're really interested in is nest success. And so we're able to find and monitor nests. And so this way we can start really getting at a sense of how productive some of these urban to rural birds are, whether or not they differ, again, along this gradient, and again, linking this to different habitat features and management programs so that we can hopefully start improving some of these conditions for urban wildlife. The second main component of the research is the outreach and the citizen science, the engagement project. And so this is a vital component to the success of the research. And so in order for us to gain access to thousands of acres of private property, we form these partnerships with householders. And they invite us into their backyards, and we're able to transform their yards into these mini field stations just for a day so that we can start investigating how their backyard birds are doing. We're able to collect our data, and then furthermore, the other main point of the project is that we train the householders on how to track their color birds, how to monitor the fates of their nests in their backyards. So in essence, they become the eyes and ears of their backyards. They become our field assistants. They watch these birds and they enter their data, and they become a part of the whole scientific process. And they also learn about science from the comforts of their own homes. And I think that they also are able to gain a deeper appreciation for their role in the ecosystem. And so not only do we uncover some really cool science, but everyone has fun. And I think these 3 images really kind of capture the spirit of the project. And so again, that feel-good factor, the happiness, and something that we can't necessarily quantify, but I think we all understand the importance of this. And so finally, I want to shift the focus on our bees. So we've talked about the birds and the trees, and now we're on to the flowers and the bees. And so there's been a lot of buzz about bees these days, especially when we think about, especially with honeybees. And one of the main drivers, well, there's been a number of different reasons for their decline, but one of the main drivers is the loss of wildlife habitat. And that's a primary concern because of their ecosystem service that they provide. And organizations like the National Wildlife Federation and Audubon have developed programs on how to improve yards for wildlife habitats. And one of the requests that some of these programs provide is to try to remove or take away some of the lawns that people have, to transform some parts of the lawn or all of the lawn into wildlife habitat, into better habitat. And I fully support that. However, when I think about the extent of these lawns, I realize this is a huge, huge challenge. And so lawns are the greatest the largest irrigated crop in the United States. And their pervasiveness is not going away. And so I started to think about, well, given the fact that these lawns are so pervasive throughout these urban areas, urban and suburban areas, how can we better manage them so they're less bad for wildlife? And so one of the things I started to think about was the types of resources that could be present within these lawns, especially when we don't fertilize these yards and try to kill everything except for the grass species. And so our current research is looking at how lawn mowing frequency might be either enhancing or inhibiting floral resources for bees. And it's also really trying to look at these lawns as potential habitat. And so the first part of our research is really looking at how lawn mowing frequency, either mowing every week, every 2 weeks, or every 3 weeks, might be affecting the number of lawn flowers that we might see in our areas. And so thinking of lawn flowers as an important resource for native bees. And what our research is showing so far is that there really is a significant difference in terms of lawn mowing frequency and the number of flowers. And so even mowing, even every 2 weeks, you have 70% more flowers in these less frequently mowed lawns. And so the next question that we're working on is how this might affect the bees, and do the bees respond to these different landscape changes? And so we've been working for the past 2 years in Springfield, Massachusetts, in lawns in Springfield, Massachusetts, to really start addressing these questions and really linking these human behaviors with these ecological processes and biological outcomes. And the way that we're able to get at this question is, again, partnering with the public, and we have been offering free lawn mowing service in exchange for the use of people's private yards. And although we're still crunching numbers, the preliminary results are suggesting that bees really are, in fact, responding to some of these different behavioral changes that we could make in our yards. So for example, again, preliminary results, we're still working on our second year of data trying to figure out some of these patterns, but what we see here is that when we mow our lawns every 2 weeks, we see a significant jump in the number of bees that these lawns could support. We're still uncertain about what's going on in every 3 weeks and why we see this decline, but from an aesthetic point of view, this might make sense in terms of trying to convince people to mow their yards every 2 weeks rather than every 3 weeks might be a better sell. From what we were gathering from our research, people just didn't seem ready to let their lawns go that much. The other thing that we were able to look at was the compaction, the soil compaction from our lawnmower. And I just want to remind you, if you remember the photograph I posted before of the person mowing the lawn, these are small push lawnmowers. This is about a 70-pound machine. And even with something so small, we're starting to see a really significant signature in terms of the compaction that these machines are making on these lawns. And so this has some really great implications for ground nesting bees, especially in light of the fact that for most of the programs out there, mostly it's for providing floral resources and not really trying to provide for nesting resources, which could be a really integral part of their life stage. But the other thing that this has some implications is perhaps stormwater management implications, and we're still trying to figure out how this research might fit within that realm. And so in sum, what I think the research is really trying to get at is that it gives you a license to mow less and just sitting back and watching the grass grow, because in fact you are doing something beneficial for wildlife. And so in summing up, I believe that working in the urban forests and engaging with the public in research really demonstrates the important role that our urban forests play in sustaining our cities and suburbs. We can provide opportunities for the public to be a part of the scientific process and increase their understanding of the processes driving their urban ecosystems. And finally, we have many opportunities to change the course of our cities. To date, of the land area projected to be developed by the year 2030, 40% has already been developed. And then so that means that there's 60% of land that has yet to be developed. And so hopefully we can use science and the public support to better design our future cities and redesign some of the areas that have already been developed so that we can ensure of their sustainability for both people and wildlife. And with that, I'd just like to thank my funding sources and the many colleagues who have helped me with this research.